In early 1942, the Wehrmacht attempted something no army had ever done, keeping an entire corps alive using only the sky. The Demjansk air bridge looked like a miraculous success, until it convinced Hitler that the same could be done at Stalingrad. What really happened inside the pocket, and why did this success quietly pave the way for one of the greatest disasters of the war? The origins of the Demjansk pocket can be traced to the wider strategic situation on the Eastern Front during the winter of 1941-1942, when the German army faced severe logistical strain, extended supply lines, and deteriorating operational capabilities. After the initial advance of Operation Barbarossa stalled in front of Moscow in December 1941, the Soviet counteroffensive forced Army Group North and Army Group Center into defensive positions stretching hundreds of kilometers. The German 15th Army Corps, later redesignated as 2 Army Corps, operating south of Lake Ilmen, found itself deployed along a broad front with insufficient forces to maintain continuous defensive lines. Its divisions, including the 12th, 30th, 32nd, 123rd, and 290th Infantry Divisions, were positioned in forested, swampy terrain that complicated movement and supply. Their manpower strength had already been reduced by months of continuous fighting, exposure to extreme winter temperatures, and significant attrition among vehicles and draft animals. Soviet strategic planning for the winter of 1941 to 1942 emphasized exploiting the overstretched German positions. The Soviet Northwestern Front, commanded by General Pavel Kurochkin, prepared a series of offensives aimed at disrupting German supply lines, encircling isolated formations, and restoring control of key communication routes between Leningrad, Moscow, and the Volga region. Intelligence assessments conducted by Soviet staff in January 1942 indicated that German forces in the Demjansk region were particularly vulnerable due to their limited mobility and reliance on narrow supply corridors. These factors contributed to the decision to launch coordinated attacks along the Lovet River and the approaches to Demjansk. On the German side, logistical conditions deteriorated rapidly during the winter months. The supply system relied on overburdened rail lines that terminated far behind the front, requiring long-distance transport by horse-drawn wagons or limited numbers of motor vehicles. Snow-covered roads and freezing temperatures increased fuel consumption and slowed the movement of essential supplies such as ammunition, food, and medical equipment. Reports from the 2nd Army Corps in late January 1942 noted shortages of artillery shells and machine gun ammunition, with some units receiving only a fraction of their requested allotments. Medical units struggled to treat frostbite and illness, which had reduced frontline strength by thousands of men even before major Soviet attacks began. Public sentiment within Germany during this period was influenced by severe winter conditions and widely disseminated reports about the fierce Soviet resistance. German propaganda outlets maintained a narrative of continued progress despite setbacks, but internal memoranda within the Wehrmacht indicated growing concern about the sustainability of extended positions. Meanwhile, the Soviet leadership emphasized the need to maintain offensive momentum. Joseph Stalin and the Stavka sought to capitalize on German weakness by launching simultaneous operations across multiple sectors, including the Northwestern Front's push toward Demjansk. The terrain surrounding Demjansk played a central role in shaping operational decisions. Thick forests, frozen marshland, and limited road networks hindered both German defensive maneuvers and Soviet offensive operations. The Lovet River Valley, one of the key geographical features, provided a possible axis for Soviet penetration. However, the harsh winter weather resulted in heavy snowfall and temperatures that frequently fell below -20°, complicating infantry movement and restricting the use of mechanized units. Nevertheless, the Soviets possessed the strategic advantage of shorter supply lines and a growing ability to deploy fresh units from reserves behind the front. By early February 1942, the Soviets initiated a large-scale offensive. Red Army units from the 11th Army and the 34th Army advanced along multiple axes with the objective of cutting off German lines of retreat between Demjansk and Staraya Russa. Their combined strength reached more than 100,000 personnel, supported by artillery concentrations placed to interdict German supply routes. German forces attempted to respond with localized counterattacks, but their reduced strength and limited mobility prevented them from halting the Soviet advance. By mid-February, Soviet units had crossed the Lovat River in several locations and disrupted the main German supply corridor via the Ramyshevo corridor. The German High Command recognized the developing danger, but lacked reserves to stabilize the front. Communications between two Army Corps and Army Group North reported the increasing likelihood of encirclement if the Soviets continued their advance westward and northward. Efforts to reinforce the threatened sector were hindered by the scarcity of available divisions and the need to defend multiple critical points along the extended front. Soviet forces pressed their advantage, deepening penetrations and expanding the encircling movement. By late February 1942, Soviet advances had effectively surrounded the German II Army Corps and several additional units, creating a pocket around Demjansk that enclosed more than 90,000 German soldiers. The formation of this pocket set the stage for one of the most significant logistical operations of the war, the Demjansk air bridge. The encirclement marked a critical point in the campaign, highlighting the strategic consequences of overstretched supply lines and foreshadowing the even larger encirclement later that year at Stalingrad. After the Soviet encirclement of the Demjansk region was completed in late February 1942, the German command faced an immediate crisis. More than 90,000 troops, primarily from the Second Army Corps, found themselves cut off within a pocket stretching roughly 60 kilometers east to west and 40 kilometers north to south. The encircled units included the 12th, 30th, 32nd, 123rd, and 290th Infantry Divisions, as well as auxiliary elements such as supply, medical, and communication units. Their defensive perimeter formed irregular lines along forest edges, frozen marshes, and partially destroyed villages, many of which had been severely affected by the winter fighting. Although the Germans retained internal cohesion, their logistical situation deteriorated rapidly in the first days of isolation, as existing supplies proved insufficient for prolonged encirclement. The initial German reaction focused on stabilizing the defensive perimeter and preventing further Soviet penetration. Defensive positions were hastily constructed along the forest belt west of Demjansk and along the Lovat River. Infantry companies reduced by casualties and illness were reorganized into composite battalions. Artillery units, facing limited ammunition stocks, shifted to strict rationing. Meanwhile, Soviet forces pressed their advantage. Units of the 11th Army and the 34th Army consolidated their positions around the pocket, constructing fortified lines and anti-tank positions to prevent any German breakout attempt. Soviet command assessed that the encircled German troops could not sustain resistance for more than a few weeks due to their logistical constraints. At Army Group North headquarters, the encirclement triggered a debate over possible courses of action. One option involved launching an immediate ground offensive to reopen the Ramyshevo corridor, the narrow link between Demjansk and Staraya Russa that had functioned as a primary supply route before its loss. However, the surrounding terrain and Soviet strength made such an operation challenging. The second option involved ordering the encircled East II Army Corps to break out on its own, but this risked heavy losses and the abandonment of heavy equipment. Instead, Hermann Göring and the Luftwaffe leadership proposed that the pocket could be supplied entirely by air. The success of limited air supply operations during earlier winter crises influenced this proposal, though the scale required for Demjansk far exceeded previous missions. The Luftwaffe calculated that the encircled corps required approximately 265 tons of supplies per day to maintain combat effectiveness. These supplies included ammunition, fuel, food, medical materials, and essential equipment. The initial airlift plan called for the deployment of transport aircraft from Transport Geschwader 1 and 2, including Ju-52 transport planes and He-111 bombers adapted for cargo missions. At the start of the operation, more than 200 aircraft were allocated, but only a portion were serviceable due to mechanical issues and weather conditions. Nevertheless, the German High Command approved the airlift on the assumption that reinforcements could eventually break through the Soviet lines and restore a land corridor. Flight operations began in early March 1942, but adverse weather conditions immediately posed challenges. Heavy snowfall, fog, and low temperatures reduced visibility and limited the number of daily sorties. Pilots were forced to land on improvised airstrips within the pocket, such as the field at Pesky, which required constant maintenance by ground crews to remain operational. Despite these difficulties, the initial days of the airlift delivered substantial quantities of supplies, enabling the encircled divisions to reorganize and reinforce their defensive positions. German reports from the pocket indicated that ammunition and food stocks stabilized temporarily, though shortages remained in several units. Soviet forces, recognizing the importance of these airfields, increased artillery bombardments around landing zones and attempted to interdict the airlifts with fighter aircraft and anti-aircraft fire. The Soviet Air Force deployed units of the 1st Air Army to disrupt the German transport planes, leading to increased losses among the Ju-52s and He-111s. At the same time, Soviet ground forces intensified attacks along key sectors of the pocket, seeking to narrow the German perimeter and reduce the number of potential landing zones. Within the pocket, daily life followed a strict routine dictated by supply shortages and intense defensive duties. Soldiers faced harsh winter temperatures that often dropped below 20 degrees Celsius, contributing to frostbite and illness. Medical facilities, already limited before the encirclement, struggled to cope with the growing number of wounded. Supply officers coordinated the distribution of air-delivered materials, prioritizing frontline units and artillery. Repair workshops attempted to keep remaining vehicles operational despite shortages of spare parts. Outside the pocket, German efforts to re-establish a land corridor progressed slowly. Ground forces assigned to the relief attempt faced strong Soviet resistance, difficult terrain, and continued supply limitations. Nevertheless, German mechanized units began moving toward the Ramoshevo area, launching localized attacks aimed at reopening the corridor. These operations would become increasingly important as the airlift revealed both its potential and its limitations. The first weeks of the Demjansk air bridge highlighted the enormous logistical burden of sustaining an encircled core solely by air. Though partially successful, the operation strained Luftwaffe resources and exposed weaknesses in air transport capacity. At the same time, the continued Soviet pressure around the pocket foreshadowed the long and costly struggle that would ultimately shape the lessons later applied, and tragically misapplied, during the encirclement at Stalingrad. German strategic planning for the continued defense of the Demjansk pocket took shape in March 1942, as both the Luftwaffe and the Army attempted to stabilize a long-term supply system. The airlift, while initially providing a lifeline for the encircled forces, demanded a level of coordination, aircraft availability, and fuel reserves that exceeded pre-war expectations. The Luftwaffe reorganized its transport units to maximize efficiency, assigning Transport Geschwader 1 and 2 to daily supply missions and integrating additional bomber units, primarily He-111s, to supplement cargo capacity. Each Ju-52 could carry roughly 1.5 tons of supplies per flight, while the modified He-111s carried smaller loads but offered higher speed. To meet the estimated daily requirement of 265 tons, planners calculated that more than 150 sorties per day were needed, a figure dependent on weather and aircraft readiness. As flight operations intensified, the improvised airfields inside the pocket became central logistical hubs. The airstrips at Pesky and later at Demjansk itself required constant maintenance to withstand the heavy traffic. Snow clearing, runway repairs, and defensive measures were conducted by hundreds of ground personnel under constant threat of Soviet artillery fire. The Soviets recognized the importance of these fields and directed artillery units to shell the surrounding areas regularly. These bombardments forced aircraft to land under hazardous conditions and contributed to the loss of several transport planes. Despite these challenges, the airfields remained operational due to continuous engineering efforts and the allocation of labor from various infantry units. As the strategic situation developed, the German High Command confronted the limitations of the airlift. Aircraft losses increased steadily. By mid-March, more than 40 transport aircraft had been destroyed or damaged beyond repair, either by Soviet fighters, anti-aircraft fire, or accidents caused by adverse weather. These losses strained Luftwaffe resources already committed to supporting multiple fronts. Nevertheless, Hitler interpreted the partial success of the Demjansk air bridge as proof that large formations could be supplied by air under encirclement. This assessment, based on incomplete data and optimistic reporting, would later influence the fatal decision to attempt similar operations at Stalingrad. Other supply challenges emerged within the pocket itself. Medical units faced severe shortages of bandages, disinfectants, and medicines. Casualties from frostbite and illness continued to accumulate, adding to the burden on overworked staff. Evacuation flights, intended to transport the wounded out of the pocket, competed for limited aircraft space with supply missions. Only a small proportion of the wounded could be evacuated daily. German command prioritized the transport of specialists and severely wounded personnel, leaving many soldiers to receive treatment in makeshift field hospitals. Meanwhile, German forces outside the pocket prepared a ground operation to break the encirclement. The relief force consisted mainly of the 218th Infantry Division and several supporting units, which attempted to push toward the Ramoshevo corridor. Their initial attacks encountered strong Soviet resistance. Soviet units held fortified positions in the forests and marshes along the approaches, supported by artillery that targeted German assembly areas. Despite localized gains, the relief forces were unable to break through during the early attempts, and German planners were forced to reassess their approach. The operational realities of the first month of the Demjansk air bridge demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of air supply on a large scale. The Luftwaffe delivered thousands of tons of supplies, enabling the German II Army Corps to maintain its defensive perimeter. However, the cost in aircraft, personnel, and fuel proved extremely high, and the Corps remained dependent on a fragile logistical system vulnerable to weather, Soviet countermeasures, and mechanical attrition. These conditions highlighted the dangers of extending such an operation over many months, even as German leadership increasingly viewed it as a demonstration of strategic resilience. German and Soviet forces entered April 1942 with the Demjansk pocket still intact, but under increasing pressure. After more than a month of isolation, the German II Army Corps faced a series of escalating engagements as Soviet commanders sought to compress the pocket and disrupt the airlift. The Soviet Northwestern Front reinforced its units and prepared coordinated attacks to narrow the German perimeter, while the Luftwaffe attempted to maintain the air bridge under deteriorating conditions. Both sides recognized that control of the Ramoshevo corridor and the airfields inside the pocket would determine the immediate future of the encircled troops. Soviet offensives during early April concentrated on the northern and western sectors of the pocket, particularly the area between the Redia and Lovat rivers. Rifle divisions, supported by artillery and mortar units, carried out multiple assaults designed to reduce the German defensive zone and bring more landing strips within direct artillery range. These attacks often achieved initial penetrations, forcing German companies to withdraw from forward positions. However, the Soviets encountered strong resistance from German infantry entrenched in fortified villages, forest belts, and bunker lines constructed during March. The Luftwaffe continued to play a central role. By April, the airlift had delivered more than 15,000 tons of supplies, a figure made possible through hundreds of daily sorties during periods of favorable weather. Still, aircraft losses mounted. Soviet air activity increased significantly as the First Air Army deployed more fighter units to intercept German transport planes. The Soviets also constructed new airstrips outside the pocket to shorten the distance for fighters patrolling the airlift routes. Despite these measures, German transport aircraft continued to land at Pesky and Demjansk, though many suffered damage from artillery fragments or harsh landing conditions. Maintenance personnel worked in freezing mud to repair airframes and restore damaged engines. Evacuation flights from the pocket intensified during April. German records reported that by the end of the month, more than 20,000 wounded or sick soldiers had been flown out. Each evacuation required careful coordination to balance limited aircraft space between supply delivery and humanitarian transport. Medical services, however, remained overwhelmed. The number of wounded exceeded the capacity of field hospitals, and shortages of medical supplies resulted in high rates of infection and mortality. Despite these hardships, German command maintained morale by emphasizing that relief forces were working to reopen the Rameshevo corridor. Outside the pocket, the German 16th Army prepared its next major attempt to break the encirclement. Reinforced by fresh units, including elements of the 5th Mountain Division and the 329th Infantry Division, the relief force focused on the sector west of Staraya Russa. Their objective was to establish a narrow but stable corridor to Demjansk. Terrain conditions posed substantial challenges. Forested areas restricted maneuver, and the spring thaw transformed dirt roads into deep mud. Nevertheless, German operational planning emphasized surprise and concentrated artillery support to push Soviet forces away from the Rameshevo sector. Soviet defenders, aware of German preparations, reinforced their lines with anti-tank positions and communication trenches. Artillery regiments positioned along elevated ground targeted German assembly zones with increasing accuracy. The Soviets aimed to prevent the reopening of the land corridor at all costs, as its restoration would jeopardize the encirclement effort and reduce the pressure on German forces inside the pocket. To counter German advances, Soviet command redeployed additional rifle divisions and increased the density of anti-tank guns along the expected axes of the relief effort. April's engagements revealed the limits of both sides' capabilities. Soviet forces lacked sufficient mechanized support due to difficult terrain and logistical challenges, slowing their attacks. German units could defend effectively, but were increasingly dependent on the airlift. Weather fluctuations further complicated operations. Heavy rains reduced visibility for aircraft, softened airstrips, and slowed troop movements on both sides. These conditions turned many battles into static engagements, dominated by artillery exchanges and small-scale infantry clashes. Civilian populations in the surrounding regions experienced continual hardship. Villages near the front suffered from repeated shelling, shortages of food, and forced evacuations. Civilians inside the pocket, primarily local residents trapped by the shifting front lines, relied on German rations and improvised supplies. Soviet units in the surrounding areas faced similar shortages as supply lines struggled to keep pace with the demands of continuous offensive operations. By late April, German relief forces made incremental progress toward Rameshevo but had not yet achieved a breakthrough. The Soviet encirclement remained intact, though stretched thin in several sectors. Within the pocket, German units held their positions despite exhaustion and limited supplies. The Demjansk air bridge continued to operate, but both the Luftwaffe and the Army increasingly recognized that the airlift alone could not sustain the corps indefinitely. The next phase of operations would depend on whether German forces outside the pocket could break through, and whether Soviet command could prevent the reopening of the corridor while maintaining pressure along the entire perimeter. German and Soviet operations around Demjansk entered a period of intensified escalation in May 1942, as both sides attempted to resolve the stalemate that had persisted since the formation of the pocket. The encircled II Army Corps continued to rely on the airlift for its daily survival, while Soviet command prepared a series of coordinated offensives aimed at collapsing the German perimeter. At the same time, German relief forces outside the pocket attempted to advance through the marshlands and forests of the Rameshevo sector, seeking to reopen a ground corridor before weather conditions and attrition made further attempts impossible. Soviet offensives during the first half of May focused on compressing the northern and western edges of the pocket. Rifle divisions from the 11th Army launched repeated assaults supported by medium and heavy artillery, with batteries positioned to fire directly into German defensive lines. The Soviets aimed to seize elevated terrain near the villages of Borki and Vasilyevo, positions that would give them improved observation and firing capability against the airfields inside the pocket. These attacks, however, encountered German fortifications that had been strengthened during April. German infantry established interlocking machine gun fields of fire, dug deep trench networks, and constructed fortified log bunkers. Soviet air units increased their interdiction efforts, deploying additional fighter regiments to contest the airspace over Demjansk. Soviet pilots targeted transport aircraft approaching Pesky and Demjansk airstrips, forcing them to fly evasive routes that increased fuel consumption and reduced cargo capacity. Anti-aircraft units also intensified their activity, positioning additional guns along likely flight paths. German transport aircraft losses rose throughout May, further straining the Luftwaffe's ability to sustain regular supply flights. Despite these losses, the airlift delivered enough material to prevent the collapse of the pocket, although not enough to support offensive action within it. Outside the pocket, German relief forces intensified their operations toward the Ramyshevo corridor. The 5th Mountain Division, supported by infantry and artillery units, advanced through forested terrain under heavy Soviet fire. These forces made slow progress, often measured in hundreds of meters per day, as Soviet defenders constructed extensive trench systems and laid dense minefields along expected avenues of attack. German engineers worked to clear mines, and corduroy roads were constructed through marshy areas to allow movement of artillery and supply vehicles. Although costly, these preparations allowed some German units to close the distance to the pocket's perimeter. Soviet resistance remained strong. Reinforced rifle divisions, supported by anti-tank brigades, held positions along the Lovot River crossings. The Soviets used the natural obstacles provided by the river and marshlands to channel German attacks into narrow corridors where they concentrated machine gun and artillery fire. High Soviet artillery density, often exceeding 40 guns per kilometer in key sectors, inflicted significant casualties. Shortfalls created temporary crises within the pocket, with some divisions reporting critical shortages of fuel, rifle ammunition, and medical supplies. By the end of May 1942, the Demjansk pocket remained under German control, but the situation on both sides had reached a new level of attrition. The Soviets had failed to collapse the pocket, but succeeded in inflicting heavy casualties and exhausting German resources. The Germans maintained their perimeter, but only because of the airlift and the slow but persistent advance of relief forces toward Ramyshevo. The stage was set for the most intense phase of the struggle, as Soviet command prepared larger operations for June, and German High Command pushed to complete the reopening of the corridor. In June 1942, the struggle around Demjansk intensified to its highest level, as both German and Soviet commands recognized that the next phase of operations would determine whether the pocket survived or collapsed. The improving weather brought clearer skies and firmer ground, conditions that allowed larger coordinated actions, but also demanded rapid adaptation to shifting tactical circumstances. For the Germans, the priority remained reopening the Ramyshevo corridor while sustaining the airlift. For the Soviets, the objective was to prevent the corridor's restoration, tighten the encirclement, and reduce the defensive perimeter through sustained multi-division assaults. The Soviets began June with a series of concentrated attacks along the southwestern and northern sectors of the pocket. These operations were designed to seize tactically significant terrain that overlooked German supply routes within the pocket and provided vantage points for Soviet artillery observers. Units from the 11th Army and 34th Army launched repeated assaults, using battalion and regimental-sized infantry groups supported by mortar and artillery barrages. Soviet command massed artillery in several key positions, achieving densities that enabled prolonged fire on German lines before infantry advanced. These attacks resulted in significant localized pressure, forcing German defenders to abandon outer trench lines and fall back to secondary positions prepared during spring. German forces inside the pocket adapted by shifting reserve companies to the most threatened sectors. Divisions reorganized with flexible defensive layouts to compensate for reduced manpower. Reports from the 290th Infantry Division indicated that many companies operated at half of their authorized strength. Nevertheless, the defensive network, composed of trench systems, machine gun positions, and fortified village strongpoints, allowed the Germans to absorb Soviet assaults despite steadily increasing casualties. Artillery support remained constrained by ammunition shortages, but air-delivered shells provided enough supply for defensive barrages during critical engagements. The Luftwaffe's role expanded as operations intensified. Clearer weather enabled transport aircraft to increase sortie numbers, with some days exceeding 200 flights. During the first 2 weeks of June, supply shipments significantly reduced shortages of rifle ammunition and rations. The airlift also brought in additional replacement personnel, though these reinforcements were limited in number and could not offset attrition caused by sustained fighting and illness. Aircraft losses, however, continued to rise. Soviet fighter formations expanded patrols across the airlift routes, and several transport aircraft were intercepted during approach or departure from landing strips. Soviet anti-aircraft fire also intensified around the pocket, further increasing risk to aircraft during low-altitude operations. Outside the pocket, the German 16th Army launched a renewed effort to break through the Soviet lines and establish a land corridor. The operation focused on the narrow Ramoshevo sector, where the distance between German-held territory and the pocket's perimeter was shortest. German forces committed several divisions, including the 5th Mountain Division and 329th Infantry Division, supported by concentrated artillery fire and pioneer units specialized in clearing minefields. The assault began in early June with a preparatory bombardment, after which German infantry advanced through marshy ground and dense forest. Soviet forces defending the corridor were well prepared. They constructed deep trench networks, multiple anti-tank positions, and strong points reinforced with log bunkers. In addition, Soviet engineers laid extensive minefields that slowed the German advance and caused significant casualties. Nevertheless, the renewed German push made incremental progress, with several Soviet forward positions captured in the first week of June. German assault groups advanced yard by yard through heavily defended areas, relying on close-quarters combat and repeated engineer support to maintain momentum. The advance toward Ramoshevo coincided with a notable shift in Soviet operational priorities. After repeated attempts to compress the pocket achieved only limited territorial gains at high cost, Soviet command reassessed its strategy, opting for a broader operational approach. Additional Soviet units were ordered to strengthen blocking positions around the corridor and to prepare for counterattacks once German forces reached the pocket's perimeter. The Soviets also intensified artillery fire on the airfields within the pocket, aiming to disrupt runway repairs and reduce the safety margins for incoming aircraft. Inside Demjansk, conditions remained difficult but manageable due to the continued airlift. Food rations stayed consistent, though limited. German ammunition levels, while constrained, were sufficient for defensive operations. The main strain came from medical shortages and the cumulative effects of months of fighting. Hospitals within the pocket remained overcrowded, and air evacuation capacity could not keep pace with the number of wounded. Frostbite cases declined with warmer temperatures, but illness from poor sanitation and contaminated water increased. Local civilian populations continued to endure severe hardships. Villages used as military positions suffered repeated shelling. Civilians living inside the pocket were subject to rationing and displacement as German units fortified residential areas. On the Soviet side of the front, the constant movement of troops and the heavy concentration of artillery left many rural areas depopulated and damaged, adding to the strain on Soviet logistical networks. By mid-June, German forces outside the pocket had advanced close enough that exchanges of small arms fire between relief units and the encircled defenders became possible in some areas. This development increased pressure on Soviet defenders in the corridor. In response, Soviet units launched counterattacks to delay the German advance, but terrain constraints and German artillery concentration limited their effectiveness. At the same time, German defensive strength inside the pocket, though strained, remained cohesive. The airlift continued to supply enough materiel to prevent collapse, but officers in the Corps recognized that long-term endurance remained uncertain. As June drew to a close, the stage was set for decisive operations. The German relief force was positioned for a major breakthrough attempt, while Soviet units prepared to counter any corridor opening with additional divisions held in reserve. The next month would determine whether the Second Army Corps could maintain its defensive positions long enough for external forces to re-establish a ground link, or whether the encirclement would tighten again, forcing the Luftwaffe to sustain an increasingly unsustainable logistical burden. By early July 1942, German and Soviet operations around Demjansk entered a critical phase defined by continuous adaptation, counteraction, and the increasing psychological strain placed on troops on both sides. After more than 4 months of encirclement, the German II Army Corps had reached a point where every aspect of its survival depended on the airlift and the slow advance of German relief forces along the Ramoshevo sector. For the Soviets, the challenge lay in preventing the Germans from linking up while managing their own attrition, deteriorating supply routes, and the cumulative effects of sustained operations across swampy, forested terrain. The German 16th Army renewed offensive activity during the first week of July to widen previous gains near the corridor. These operations involved coordinated infantry and artillery actions supported by pioneer units tasked with clearing obstacles. Progress remained slow but measurable. German troops captured several Soviet strongpoints, including fortified positions in the forest belts west of the Lovat River. These gains enabled German engineers to construct temporary roads through marshy ground, allowing field artillery to move forward and provide closer support to attacking infantry. Despite these tactical improvements, German planners understood that the corridor had to be secured quickly, as the airlift, though functioning, remained strained by rising losses and chronic shortages of spare parts. Soviet forces opposing the German advance strengthened their defenses accordingly. Rifle divisions deployed dense anti-personnel minefields and constructed multiple fallback trenches to absorb German pressure. Soviet command also rotated units from adjacent sectors to reinforce the Ramoshevo front, prioritizing divisions with higher manpower and better logistical support. Artillery concentrations were increased, with additional batteries positioned on elevated terrain to target German staging areas. Soviet units consistently launched small-scale counterattacks to disrupt German preparations, though these often resulted in heavy casualties due to concentrated German defensive fire. Inside the Demjansk pocket, German forces continued to adapt to sustained Soviet pressure. Divisional commanders reorganized depleted battalions into flexible Kampfgruppen that could be shifted rapidly between threatened sectors. Frontline units relied heavily on the Luftwaffe's deliveries of ammunition, fuel, and replacement weapons. German reports from early July noted the delivery of significant quantities of mortar rounds, which proved essential for stopping Soviet infantry assaults in forested areas where visibility remained restricted. However, the volume of supplies remained at the limit of the Luftwaffe's capacity. Aircraft losses, mechanical breakdowns, and the high daily requirement of over 200 tons of material left little margin for interruption. The Luftwaffe also faced increasingly efficient Soviet air opposition. Fighter units from the Soviet Air Force expanded their patrols along approach routes to the pocket, coordinating intercept missions with ground-based anti-aircraft units. Several German Ju-52s and He-111s were lost during July as Soviet pilots improved their interception techniques and exploited predictable flight patterns. In response, the Luftwaffe adjusted its tactics, conducting more flights at dawn and dusk and varying routes to reduce predictability. Nonetheless, the cumulative loss of transport aircraft reduced overall delivery capacity, raising concerns within both the Luftwaffe Command and the Second Army Corps about the long-term sustainability of the airlift. Soviet ground operations during July exhibited increased coordination. Assault groups advanced in multiple waves, supported by artillery barrages designed to suppress German machine gun positions. In several sectors, Soviet forces temporarily breached German defensive lines before being repelled by counterattacks. These engagements inflicted substantial casualties on both sides, contributing to the gradual erosion of German manpower within the pocket. By mid-July, several German infantry companies reported operational strengths of fewer than 40 soldiers. Despite this, discipline and cohesion within the pocket remained intact, largely due to effective leadership and the continued belief that the relief force would eventually break through. The humanitarian situation inside the pocket showed the cumulative strain of prolonged encirclement. Medical stations exceeded their capacities, and shortages of medical supplies persisted. The summer heat increased the risk of disease, particularly dysentery, due to limited sanitation and contaminated water supplies. Field hospitals struggled to treat wounded soldiers, many of whom were housed in overcrowded shelters built from local timber. Although the Luftwaffe evacuated hundreds of wounded during July, evacuation capacity continued to lag behind medical demand. Outside the pocket, the German 16th Army's advance toward Ramyschewo continued, but remained slow. Soviet defensive lines, though under pressure, remained largely intact, supported by fresh units rotated from the Stavka Reserve. The terrain continued to serve as a natural ally to the defenders. Marshes, dense thickets, and narrow forest paths restricted German maneuver and forced infantry to advance along predictable routes. German engineers attempted to mitigate these limitations by constructing wooden causeways and improving drainage in selected sectors, but the overall progress remained incremental. Recognizing the pressure on the corridor sector, Soviet command prepared for a major defensive effort to counter the next German push. Additional artillery was redeployed to the area, and 2 divisions were assigned to form a mobile reserve capable of reinforcing threatened points. Soviet divisions depleted by earlier attacks were withdrawn for rest and reorganization, replaced by units with higher combat effectiveness. This rotation aimed to maintain a stable defensive posture against the anticipated German breakthrough attempts. By late July, both sides understood that the fighting had reached a critical juncture. The Germans needed to open the corridor before the Luftwaffe's capacity declined further, while the Soviets sought to prevent it long enough to rebuild their own strength and prepare more comprehensive offensives. The psychological strain became evident among soldiers on both sides. German troops expressed confidence in eventual relief, but also fatigue from months of trench warfare and constant bombardment. Soviet soldiers, although receiving reinforcements, faced the unyielding challenge of attacking well-fortified positions under difficult terrain and operational conditions. As July ended, the situation remained balanced on a narrow edge. The German 16th Army stood on the threshold of reopening the corridor, while Soviet forces remained determined to prevent any link-up. The next phase of operations would determine whether the Demjansk airlift could be replaced by a secure land route, or whether the encirclement would tighten once more, prolonging the ordeal inside the pocket and further straining both the Luftwaffe and the Army. By early August 1942, the struggle for control of the Ramyschewo sector reached its decisive turning point, as German forces intensified their efforts to breach the Soviet defenses and establish a permanent ground corridor to the Demjansk pocket. After months of attrition, shifting weather, and fluctuating supply levels, both sides recognized that the coming engagements would determine whether the pocket could maintain its viability or whether the Luftwaffe would be forced to sustain an increasingly unsustainable airlift. Operational planning on both sides reflected the gravity of the situation. The Germans focused all available resources on a concentrated push toward Ramyschewo, while Soviet commanders reinforced the sector with fresh units to prevent a link-up at any cost. The German 16th Army initiated its largest coordinated assault of the campaign during the first week of August. The operation involved multiple divisions advancing simultaneously along a narrow front west of the Lovat River. German artillery, brought forward through recently constructed causeways, conducted preparatory barrages targeting Soviet bunkers, trench lines, and artillery positions. Assault battalions then moved forward under covering fire, making use of fog and early morning conditions to minimize Soviet observation. Pioneer units equipped with explosives tackled strongpoints and cleared pathways through minefields, enabling infantry to penetrate deeper into Soviet lines than in previous attempts. Soviet forces defending the Ramyschewo sector responded with intense resistance. Rifle divisions established layered defensive positions, with each trench line supported by mortar sections, anti-tank guns, and machine gun nests. Despite heavy German bombardments, Soviet units frequently regrouped and launched immediate counterattacks aimed at isolating and eliminating German assault groups. Soviet artillery, positioned on elevated ground, targeted German assembly zones and supply routes, slowing the pace of the advance and inflicting steady casualties. The Soviets also committed mobile reserves to stabilize sectors threatened by German penetrations, ensuring that no breakthrough could be achieved without sustained effort. Inside the Demjansk pocket, German forces prepared to coordinate with the external relief effort. The airlift's continued functioning provided psychological reinforcement for the encircled troops, who remained convinced that the corridor would soon reopen. However, the cumulative loss of aircraft remained a major concern. By early August, more than 100 transport aircraft had been destroyed or lost due to combat, mechanical failure, or landing accidents, reducing operational capacity and straining Luftwaffe logistics. The geopolitical context surrounding the Demjansk operations also shifted during August. As the Eastern Front expanded southward with German offensives toward the Volga and the Caucasus, Soviet command faced increasing pressure to allocate reserves to other critical sectors. Nevertheless, Stavka maintained significant troop concentrations around Demjansk, viewing the destruction of the pocket as both a tactical and symbolic objective. The Soviets sought to prevent any German victory that could strengthen Army Group North or free German divisions for redeployment to the south. Consequently, several Soviet units originally slated for transfer were retained in the area, enabling sustained defensive operations but stretching Soviet logistics across multiple fronts. As the month progressed, German forces continued to push toward the perimeter, capturing several key positions along forested ridges and clearing Soviet trenches through a combination of close-quarters combat and sustained artillery support. In some sectors, German units advanced more than 2 kilometers, a significant distance given the dense terrain and previous operational constraints. This progress brought German and Soviet forces within direct small arms range of one another along parts of the Ramushevo corridor. Communications between advancing German divisions and the encircled Second Army Corps became more frequent, signaling that the corridor's reopening was imminent. Soviet commanders reacted by committing their remaining reserves to the threatened sector. Reinforcements included fresh rifle units equipped with newly delivered small arms and supported by additional anti-tank guns. These units attempted to restore defensive lines through repeated counterattacks, but many encountered German forces entrenched in recently captured positions, supported by artillery fired from short range. Soviet efforts slowed the German advance but could not reverse the overall trend. Inside the pocket, the cumulative stress of prolonged combat, limited supplies, and harsh environmental conditions continued to affect morale and combat effectiveness. Summer heat replaced winter's frostbite with new challenges, including water shortages and increased incidence of illness. Medical facilities remained overburdened, with casualty lists growing steadily. Despite these difficulties, the certainty that the corridor would soon reopen provided a stabilizing effect that sustained unit cohesion and combat readiness. By the end of August, German engineering units had begun constructing rudimentary supply routes toward the pocket, anticipating imminent contact. The narrowing distance between advancing German forces and the pocket's perimeter, measured in hundreds of meters, convinced both commands that the decisive moment was close. Soviet units continued to resist fiercely, aware that reopening the corridor would undermine months of operational effort. Yet their ability to counter renewed German assaults weakened as reinforcements dwindled and supply lines strained under the pressure of defending multiple fronts simultaneously. As August closed, the Demjansk battlefield had transformed from a prolonged stalemate into an arena of accelerated operations. German forces were on the verge of reopening the land corridor, while Soviet units faced mounting pressure to prevent a link-up. Both sides recognized that the next phase of combat would not only determine the immediate fate of the pocket, but also influence broader strategic outcomes for Army Group North and the Northwestern Soviet Front. By early September 1942, the final stage of the struggle for the Demjansk pocket unfolded with a combination of sustained German offensives, Soviet countermeasures, and the mounting operational exhaustion visible across all participating units. After months of fighting, the narrowing distance between German relief forces and the encircled Second Army Corps suggested that a breakthrough was imminent, yet the Soviets continued to reinforce their positions in the Ramyshevo sector, hoping to prevent or at least delay the opening of a stable land corridor. Both sides operated under severe constraints. The Germans contended with depleted manpower and strained logistics, while Soviet forces faced diminishing reserves, cumulative attrition, and the need to respond to crises emerging along other parts of the Eastern Front. German operations at the beginning of September focused on completing the link between the relief forces and the pocket's southern perimeter. Units of the 16th Army launched a coordinated offensive supported by artillery, pioneers, and mobile detachments tasked with exploiting any breach in Soviet defenses. Assault groups pressed forward along forest paths and marshy clearings, capturing several Soviet trenches and strongpoints. The advance progressed in small but steady increments, often measured in hundreds of meters per day, as German forces cleared minefields, dismantled bunker systems, and pushed deeper into the Soviet defensive network. With the front lines narrowing, transport aircraft began delivering supplies to improvised landing zones closer to the anticipated breakthrough point. Soviet air and artillery activity continued to target these airstrips, resulting in several losses and forced crash landings. Nevertheless, the Luftwaffe succeeded in maintaining sufficient daily supply throughput to prevent German ammunition and fuel stocks from falling to critical levels. As September progressed, the increasing proximity of German relief forces allowed the Luftwaffe to reduce flight distances marginally, improving efficiency, but not alleviating the overall strain on aircraft and crews. Soviet command recognized the deteriorating situation in the Ramyshevo sector. Stavka ordered several local reinforcements to hold the corridor closed, though the availability of fresh units was limited by concurrent operations further south, particularly around Rzhev and Stalingrad. Consequently, Soviet commanders increasingly relied on delaying tactics, small-scale counterattacks, rapid redeployment of surviving mortar and artillery units, and the construction of new trench lines behind those previously lost. Soviet units also attempted to disrupt German artillery concentrations through targeted night raids and limited infiltration operations. German engineering units played a critical role during the September operations. As forward infantry captured parts of the Soviet trench systems, engineers constructed provisional roadways to bring artillery and supplies closer to the front. They also cleared debris from forest paths, repaired damaged bridges, and installed drainage systems to counter the persistent marshiness of the terrain. These engineering efforts enabled German infantry to sustain the pace of their advance and maintain pressure on Soviet defenders. By mid-September, the distance between the pocket's perimeter and the leading elements of the relief force narrowed to less than 1 kilometer in several sectors. German reconnaissance patrols established intermittent visual contact with units inside the pocket. This development increased morale among the encircled troops, who intensified their efforts to hold defensive positions and repel Soviet assaults. However, Soviet forces, aware that the breakthrough was imminent, launched a series of intensive counterattacks designed to restore defensive depth or at least delay the link-up. These counteroffensives, conducted by mixed units drawn from several rifle divisions, resulted in heavy casualties on both sides. Inside the pocket, conditions remained strained. Medical facilities suffered from overcrowding, shortages of supplies, and limited evacuation opportunities. While the Luftwaffe continued to remove some of the wounded, the number transported remained far below demand.